You are watching In Conversation This Week with Miceal O'Hurley.
Today, we're joined on In Conversation This Week with the esteemed ambassador of Israel, His Excellency Mr. Ophir Kariv. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to In Conversation This Week.
Thank you very much, Miceal. It's a pleasure being here.
Mr. Ambassador, the last time we saw each other, if I'm not correct, was at the U.S. Ambassador's residence on July 4th. I think it was 2 years ago, before the pandemic. How have you been holding up during the pandemic? What has it been like for you to try to conduct diplomacy and consular services in the midst of all these lockdowns?
Complicated, which I guess this is the case for each and every one of us. We had to adapt to the new realities, to the new restrictions, but still try and carry out our work as best as possible. Consular services, of course, continued throughout these times to Israeli citizens and the others that needed our assistance. From the diplomatic point of view, well, we've been learning, like everyone else, to use virtual platforms in order to carry out our work, but no doubt that the personal touch, the personal face-to-face meetings, meeting people in person is missing, and it, I would imagine that most of us, including colleagues of mine, would also say the same thing. As diplomats, our work revolves around meeting people, making connections, making the personal connections, and this is more difficult, much more difficult to do online than it is in person.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, let me just say that we're pleased to have you on In Conversation This Week, and we hope that that extends your diplomatic reach and your ability to meet people, even if it's virtually, across Ireland and throughout the world. Before we jump into a lot of the issues, I want to talk to you about your time in Ireland. How long have you been here and how have you found it so far?
Well, I arrived in October 2018, so just about 2.5 years from now. Before coming here, I had headed the Northern Europe department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Jerusalem, and in that capacity, I used to cover also Ireland. So we can say that I've been following Ireland to this extent or another for the last 4.5 years, more or less. I knew where I was coming. I knew at least the basics of Ireland. I hope so. So far, I find my stay here very rewarding professionally, very pleasant on the personal level. Of course, there are issues, and I'm sure that we'll touch upon them later in this interview. But I find my conversations, my discourse with my Irish counterparts very fulfilling, very interesting, sometimes challenging. But even though there are challenges on the professional level, I would say that on the personal level, my stay here has been very pleasant, and I find the Irish very open, very friendly, very warm. In a sense, not that different than Israelis.
Mr. Ambassador, that's good to hear. Have you had a chance to attend any of our sporting events yet? It's a very important part of our fabric and our national culture. Have you been to Croke Park? Have you been to see any matches? Have you gotten out to see much of the country yet?
Well, I had not much of sports, I'm afraid. I've missed few opportunities. I was hoping to have more, but Corona stepped in and kind of spoiled my intentions there. I did have some opportunities to travel around the country. It's a beautiful country, really beautiful country. And I spent time up in Donegal and on the West Coast and also down in Kerry for some time in Cork. I also do some sailing on my spare time, so I also had the opportunity to see some of the spots in Ireland, also from the sea, I would say, from the off the coast. Also very, very lovely. You have a great country here.
Mr. Ambassador, that's really encouraging to hear. I too am a sailor, so you're invited to Cork. We'll throw out a spinnaker, bury the rails, and if I'm not much mistaken, I think our Foreign Affairs Minister, Simon Coveney, is a sailing enthusiast, and we might just sail by him someday. I want to jump into the issue of the pandemic. How has the pandemic affected Israel, and where do you stand today on vaccinations?
Okay, so the pandemic has hit Israel like it hit many other countries, most of the countries of the world, actually. And we've been through 3 very strict lockdowns since it all started. And we've seen, like in Ireland, like in many other places, the impacts on the economy to a certain extent, on the individuals and on the way daily lives have been carried out. We are happy to say that at least on the vaccination front, we are quite advanced. We reached very early very early on, we reached agreements with Pfizer that have seen, and since then we've seen a large quantity of vaccines being provided to Israel, and parallel to that, the Israeli healthcare system, which is quite advanced and quite efficient, enabled us to move forward very quickly with vaccinations. And today we see more than half of the population fully vaccinated after 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine, and we're still carrying on with that. At the same time, we are sharing information with the rest of the world. This quick vaccination drive in Israel provides essential information both to Pfizer, to the manufacturer, and to other countries, in the sense of the outcomes of the vaccinations, the effects of the vaccinations, and the process and lessons learned. And we are very happy to share it with the rest of the world.
In relation to the vaccinations, aside from Pfizer, are you using the Johnson & Johnson, the AstraZeneca? Has there been any discussion of the use of the Sputnik 5 vaccination from Russia? Where do you stand on the different vaccinations that you're offering the population?
So far, we've been using only the Pfizer because of this special agreement that we reached with that company. That enabled us to receive, again, very large quantities of Pfizer vaccines in exchange for sharing the information, the lessons learned from using those vaccinations. There is smaller amount of Moderna in Israel, of Moderna vaccines, but we are basing ourselves right now on, so far we've been basing ourselves on the Pfizer vaccines.
Mr. Ambassador, there's been a measure of criticism that Israel has interfered with the supply of vaccines to the occupied Palestinian territories, that Palestinians are being discriminated against in their access to vaccines, and that we've come up with what the media calls an apartheid system with access to the vaccines and vaccine poverty when it comes to the Palestinian people. Can you speak to that for us?
Yes, well, first, I mean, this it's very sad and very disturbing that that even the Corona crisis has been weaponized by our enemies in order to attack us, and we have to make things very, very clear. We never interfered with supply of vaccines to the Palestinians in the West Bank or Gaza. We've been facilitating the supply of vaccines. We've been cooperating very closely with the Palestinian Authority from day one on supplies, and facilitated the supply of equipment, of medical training, of other measures to deal with the pandemic, including with the supply of vaccines. Now, it's very important to remember, according to the agreements between Israel and the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority has the authority and the responsibility for the healthcare system in the Palestinian areas. And this is what they do, and they've signed agreements with the various suppliers in order to receive vaccinations. We are facilitating the transfer of those vaccines wherever we can. In addition to that, Israel is vaccinated from the vaccines that we have in Israel. We vaccinated over 100,000 Palestinians that come to work in Israel. We vaccinated UN workers, UN agency workers that work also with Israel, Palestinian ones, and of course, diplomatic staff in Israel. In no way is there any discrimination against anyone in Israel. In Israel itself, when you go and look at the vaccine process, everyone, Arabs, Jews, Muslims, Christians, everyone are entitled and are getting the vaccines exactly at the same, under the same conditions and totally equal. The notion of apartheid is an ugly and malicious weaponization of this coronavirus crisis against Israel. And I think anyone who uses the word apartheid when it comes to Israel is either total ignorant or his motives are very, very unclear. And he should go back, those ignorants have to go back to the dictionary and learn what apartheid is.
Mr. Ambassador, let me parse this because words are meaningful in diplomacy. You say that within Israel, there's no discrimination. A lot of people would argue that in practice, Israel occupies the Palestinian territories, and saying that within Israel there isn't discrimination ignores the fact that the Palestinians aren't getting the access to vaccines at the same rate as Israelis. And that has largely to do with Israel's control over the Gaza and West Bank. Can you speak to that for us, please?
That goes again to this to the political question, because the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank are citizens of the Palestinian Authority. They hold Palestinian citizenship, for that matter, so Palestinian documents. And according to the agreements that are in effect, the Palestinians are those, the Palestinian Authority is the one that is responsible for providing them with vaccines and with all kinds of other health services. By the way, the Palestinians do not deny that, and this is what they do. The Palestinian Authority, as I mentioned, has been in contact and has signed agreements with various vaccine suppliers in order to vaccinate their own people, and we help in that as much as we can. We facilitate the transfer of those vaccines, and in addition to that, both on the humanitarian level, but also because we are in very close contact with the Palestinian areas, it is also in our interest to help them get vaccinated as quickly as possible, and this is what we've been doing. And as I mentioned, we have already vaccinated over 100,000 Palestinians. It's nothing to do with discrimination. This is exactly as saying that the two lines in Dublin airport, one for Europeans and one for non-Europeans, is discrimination. This is not the case. There's no discrimination in Israel based on ethnicity or religion or sex or anything else. There are political differences in political status. Those that are Palestinians and they are citizens of the Palestinian Authority and residents of the Palestinian Authority are under the responsibility of the Palestinian Authority. And we are helping them as much as possible, and this has been acknowledged also by the UN.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to pick up on something you said about humanitarian, that it's in Israel's interest to assist the Palestinian people. One of the greatest gifts of our shared heritage of Abraham the Talmudic scholarship, the Talmud, the Bible, the Quran, is that sense of humanity. Israel, a Jewish state, champions an ethic called tikkun olam. Forgive my Hebrew, it's not as good as yours, I'm sure. It's to perfect a broken world. What is Israel doing to make Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories more humane? We read daily about schools being bulldozed, buildings being destroyed, settlements being erected. Where's the future of this? I had hope a number of years ago. I knew Shimon Peres. I knew many of the Israeli leaders from my work in Washington. Is that ethos still alive to create the kind of world that was envisaged by the accord signed with the Palestinian Authority?
Yes, well, tikkun olam, as you say, is an important principle in Judaism, and it's also one of the things that is at the heart and the basis of Israel, and I'll elaborate on that. First of all, Israel has been working for this tikkun olam, and maybe for our listeners, tikkun olam means something like amending the world or making the world a better place from its early days. And we've seen there's an agency in Israel that is operated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's called Mashav. Mashav is the parallel of Irish Aid. And Israel Aid and Technical Assistance activities started back in 1958, when Israel itself was a very small, weak, and fledgling state, I would say. And we've been operating all around the world, in Africa and Latin America, in Asia, training people and transferring information and transferring experience and so on. Since the Oslo Accords, after the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993, we used to have quite an extensive program with the Palestinian Authority, training, technology, training of Palestinians, technology transfer, and so on. This activity has been reduced, unfortunately, in the last few years. I mean, for the only reason that the Palestinians stopped coming. They just don't want to come. It's not that they cannot. They just don't want to come. And part of their, unfortunately, one of the steps that the Palestinian Authority taken was to cut all cooperation with Israel, and that affects also this technical cooperation and aid cooperation. As far as what you refer to, the news that we hear every now and then, it's important to understand the cases that you are referring to, the cases that came up that came to the Irish media in the last few months. We are speaking about construction of illegal buildings or setting up of installations or whatever you call them in areas C. Now, area category C in the West Bank, these are areas that under the agreements are under the full responsibility of Israel, both civilian and security responsibility of Israel. And when somebody wants to build something, or somebody wants to establish something or set up something, he has, like in any other place, get a permission from the authorities. Unfortunately, these kind of activities are also very heavily politicized by the Palestinians. Unfortunately, a lot of aid money, European aid money, sometimes goes into those activities, knowingly that these are illegal activities. And this is, again, being used for political reasons. This is essentially what stands behind it. Those aid money are being used to projects that are knowingly in advance. They know that these are illegal because they haven't received the right authorizations from the Israeli authorities. These things can be prevented if these kind of initiatives are being coordinated with Israel. But again, it's very heavily politicized, I'm afraid.
Mr. Ambassador, Benjamin Franklin, a 19th century philosopher, scientist, and diplomat, once observed that revolutions are always legal in the first person, such as our revolution. It's only in the second person, their revolution, that it becomes illegal. Palestinians continue to tell me that by Israel declaring these buildings and initiatives to be illegal, it ignores the fact that Israel doesn't make them possible through permitting processes, that you can't get permission. And therefore, it's easy for Israel to criticize them as illegal when it never gives permission for construction to happen. And to the contrary, what are called illegal Israeli settlements pop up every day. Can you speak to these issues for us?
Maybe we should talk first about the issue of settlements and the overall Israeli presence there, because I think it reflects also on the more technical issues. First of all, we should remember that both Israelis and Palestinians have claim to those lands. Okay, this has been the case. Israelis and Palestinians, or Jews and Arabs, whatever you want to call it, it depends on which chapter in history we talk about, have been fighting, unfortunately, for the same piece of land for the last 120 years or so. And at the end of the day, we must find a way to live together in this land in this way or another. The West Bank, what you call the West Bank, we call Judea and Samaria, because this is where the Jewish people was born, and this is where it developed, and this is where its history is. The West Bank is a contested territory. These are disputed territories, and the two sides have claims to it. Okay. So there, first of all, we should remember that there's no basic legal or illegal basis to the claims of either of the side. No overruling claim to the Palestinian claim of no overruling stand to the ruling of the claim of the Palestinian side. Now, the Palestinians can apply, and quite a few plans have been done in the Israeli authorities. By the Israeli authorities that are controlling Area C. And I believe that if Palestinians and Europeans really try, they can also do it in a legal way. If they have their disagreements, they can always, as they have been doing, approach the Israeli court system, the legal system, that is known to be it's known to be very professional. And very often also, its rulings are not always to the taste of the Israeli government, I would say, but also not always to the taste of the Palestinian side. So the tools are there and the ways are there, and they should conduct their actions in a legal way. Resorting to illegal actions, it's not the way in any case.
Tell me more about Israel's perspective, your views on the competing historical claims to the territory in which you both live.
Okay, thank you. This is a very important question, because this is an underlying issue for many of the issues that are discussed when we come to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And we should remember, we have a situation here when two peoples claim the same piece of land. Jewish people was set up, it was created in this part of the land. This is where it grew, and its history there is well documented and goes back thousands of years. The Palestinians have their own claims. Now, the two peoples, the Israeli or Jewish people and the Palestinians, have been fighting each other for the same piece of land for the last 120 years since the the two national movements were established and started operating. This argument has not been settled yet. And we see this contest or this struggle around the same land taking and changing forms along the way. And what we see in the West Bank today is actually part of it. I mean, we are still in the process of trying to reach an agreement and to find a solution for the two peoples claiming the same piece of land. And, but I do believe that this has to be also when the Palestinians are trying to sometimes make facts on the ground, to create facts on the ground, they have to do it in the legal through legal processes and legally. Certainly when European countries are involved and European aid money is involved, it has to be done through using legal processes. And I remind everyone again, most of the issues or the issues that we've seen lately on the Irish media had to do with projects in Area C, which is under the agreements, under the prevailing agreements, under the authority of Israel. And everything, any project has been carried out there, that has been done there, has to be done in coordination with the Israeli authorities. And it should not be politicized as it is now.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to talk about the Oslo Accords, if we can return to those for a second. It envisaged that there would be a resolution of these issues and a two-state solution. What can be done to breathe life back into those accords, which still remain the only realistic opportunity for a resolution in the future? Or do you disagree?
Well, we disagree on quite a few issues, but the main problem is that the Palestinians, unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority, for many years now, has been refusing to come back to the negotiating table. I cannot say that the solutions will be simple. The process is going to be difficult. And neither side is going to get everything it wants, because this is the nature of negotiations, as we know. But in order to start the way, you have to sit at the table. And this is, I'm sorry, but this is very evident that the Palestinian Authority has been refusing to come back to the negotiating table for many years.
I want to talk, if I can, about some of the success Israel has had lately with what is deemed the Abraham Accords. You've established enhanced diplomatic relations and accords with neighbors. Will those have a positive impact on forging peace with the Palestinian people and reaching the goals of the Oslo Accord, or do you not see that playing a role at present?
No, I think it has a very important role to play. First, those agreements are based on and are coming out of a very strong common basis and common interests between Israel and the Gulf states, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan. I think that more and more Arab states are getting to realize that Israel is not an enemy, but a partner, and a partner that with which those countries can work together for the prosperity of their nations, of their peoples, and for the prosperity of the whole region. This atmosphere of cooperation and this atmosphere of development and positivity, we hope will reflect also and project also on the on our closer neighbors. And we do hope that more and more countries will join this circle of peace. And we do believe that this will create also the environment and the platform, maybe also the platform, also for the Palestinians to join in. Because the Palestinian Authority has to decide, and they have to make a choice. Are they joining this peaceful circle, the Abraham Accords, or are they the other way, the way of the way of Hamas, the way of Iran's proxies in the region, and this axis? We do see it as having a huge potential, both for the peoples of the countries involved and for the region as providing this framework and this supporting environment for peace also with the Palestinians. And we do hope they join in.
Mr. Ambassador, I agree with you. You can't resolve issues unless you sit down and talk with people. I've been a mediator for over 30 years and worked in the international community on peace accords and conflict resolution. So let me ask you, President Trump defunded and almost banished the Palestinians from Washington. The U.S. has an oversized footprint in the Middle East when it comes to foreign policy and international relations. Would you support the robust presence of the Palestinians in Washington as a role towards creating a more constructive dialogue that might lead to resolution of these issues?
No, I will not get into U.S.-Palestinian relations and whether the Palestinians should be in the U.S. or so. This has been between the U.S. and the Palestinians. I do believe, and as I imagine most realistic people who deal with the Middle East, I believe, in what you started with, is that the United States is the major external player in the Middle East and the one player that can help the parties to come together. But we should also remember that no third party can force the two sides to the conflict to come to an agreement. And we've seen it in previous agreements in the Middle East, and we've seen it in Ireland. We saw it also in Ireland. I mean, if we look, let's go back to the first peace accord that Israel had with Egypt. The first contact was made between Israelis and Egyptians. The two sides were ripe for an agreement. Only when the two sides are ripe for the agreement, they agree and start their contacts, can a third party step in and support it and help in mediating and help with providing guarantees and so on. You cannot have a third party force two sides that are not ripe and not ready for an agreement to reach an agreement. First, the two sides have to be ready for it themselves. And I think you can see it in every successful, peaceful arrangement, any real peace agreement in recent history. And the United States is the major player in this sense, that will continue to be so.
Your Excellency, this brings us to another issue that involves the United States and the region, and that's the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuke deal, if you will. Israel has seemingly stood opposed to the JCPOA and taken a far more militant stance towards Iran, claiming it's a bad actor in the region. The U.S. may need the JCPOA to be able to reach its long-term policy objectives. Where does this leave Israel with the JCPOA, with the Biden administration now stating that it is their goal to rejoin it, restart it, and see it become a durable instrument?
Well, we've been very clear on it from day one. The JCPOA, as it was signed, is a bad agreement. It's a bad agreement that practically leaves Iran with the opportunity to rush for nuclear weapons in only a few years. And our basic view of this agreement has not changed.
Mr. Ambassador, let me cut across you there, and I apologize. No one, including Iran or the United States or the P5+1, nobody would think that it was a great agreement. But it was the best agreement that could be reached. And in the alternative, or should I say the absence of an agreement, what is the alternative?
I think the alternative, well, first of all, this is your view that this was the best agreement that could have been achieved. I'm not sure. I was not in the room. We should also remember that Iran did not come to the negotiations on the JCPOA because it really loved the idea. They came because they were under very intensive pressure of sanctions and a very strong stand at that time led by the United States. This is what brought the Iranians almost forcefully to the negotiating table. And I think the strategy of maximum pressure should be maintained in order to make sure that Iran never has the opportunity and the ability to have to reach a nuclear power, to reach nuclear weapons. We don't believe that the JCPOA is the right tool for that, because the agreement has many holes. The agreement does not deal with key issues. Whether these are what happens in a few years, the sunset clause, as everybody's what is known as sunset clause. It doesn't deal with the rest of the Iranian activities in the region. It doesn't deal with the Iranian ballistic capabilities. And as it is, the JCPOA itself, as it is an agreement. It does not provide. It does not provide what it was meant to be.
Mr. Ambassador, I think that the United States disagrees. I think that Europe would like to see it restarted. I think that the five major powers, I think that this is going to be an issue that's with us for some time. It's not resolved yet. It's becoming critically important for all the parties involved. And as you say, there are sunset provisions that will disappear in the not too distant future. In brief, do you think it can be restarted? And if it is Israel willing to become a collaborator in it, or would Israel rule out any agreement with Iran whatsoever?
I don't know what kind of agreement, if at all, will be achieved. I'm not sure. I don't know what will happen in the future. Rolling back to the same point when running back a few years is impossible. The Iranians have acquired new capabilities that are not rolled back anymore. So it's very difficult to come back to the agreement as it was. This is our view. We are continuing to, again, we have a very intimate and close discussions and discourse with our American friends, where we do sound our positions, but we are very strong on that. I mean, the Iran as a nuclear power is not a theoretical issue for us. It's an existential issue, because you hear time and again, you hear the Iranians speak very openly on erasing Israel from the map. They are doing practical steps as much as they can in order to advance their aims through their proxies, whether in Lebanon, Syria, Gaza Strip. Well, as history taught us, when people are very persistent in saying that they want to annihilate us, we should listen to it, because sometimes they do try it. Only yesterday, we marked in Israel the Israeli Holocaust Memorial Day. And we remember what happens when real threats, and Iran is a real threat. Let's not underestimate it. It's a major power, and it's a major power that is thriving for nuclear power. It is headed by a very, very extremist religious leadership, very extremist, anti-Semitic, and that has been very, very clear on its intentions. History shows us that we should not overlook this kind of threats, certainly when they are going to be combined with nuclear weapons.
Yeah. Mr. Ambassador, I want to pick up on the issue of the Holocaust. Are you aware of an Irish woman from Cork, no less, by the name of Mary Elms?
Yes.
Okay, you know, we both know Mary Elms' history. She saved over 200 Jews during the Holocaust. Would you take our invitation to visit the real Irish capital, Cork, on the next commemoration and pay tribute to Mary Elms and the community's commitment to peace and remembering the Holocaust?
I would be honored to do that. Just don't get me in trouble with the Dubliners, with the Cork being the real capital, please.
International relations are hard enough, but Cork and Dublin is something that's above our pay scale. Your Excellency, Israel is known by everyone, even its detractors, as a cradle of startup businesses. It's an engine driving the regional economies. Tell me about the opportunities for trade, technology, and education with Ireland. What's the future hold there?
At first, as you said, Israel and Ireland are quite similar in many senses. Israel has been, as you say, cradle of innovation, of technology, of development, and so is Ireland. We are both relatively small countries with relatively small markets. We are very much export-oriented, both Ireland and Israel. But we are both hubs for major multinational companies. And we always know that, always when Intel, for example, goes for another major investment outside the United States, usually Israel and Ireland are the contenders for that. So there are many ways in which the two countries, I believe, can cooperate. I believe that in the field of innovation and technological cooperation, 1 and 1 usually equals much more than 2. And I believe there's a lot of potential there. We can also learn from each other. And if to mark just a few fields of possible cooperation that have a lot of potential. First, I mean, coronavirus, various technologies and methods to deal with the coronavirus. And we see a lot of innovation, a lot of entrepreneurship around developing various ways to deal with it, both in Ireland and Israel, and I believe we can share a lot on that. Green economy and green technology, which is very important both in Ireland and in Israel. Israel is very advanced with solar energy. Ireland has its own relevant experience. Cybersecurity, which is becoming essential to much of our technological societies. Telecommunications, being promoted very strongly here in Ireland and in Israel. Water management that sometimes come to the headlines here in Ireland, but Israel has a lot of experience in water management on all, both water management, water treatment on all its dimensions. Education, and here in education we have, of course, technological education, the engineering and so on. But another thing that is very interesting, it touches upon education, but not only, it's the issue of language. I mean, the Hebrew language was revived from a language that had been used only for prayers for centuries. And in the last just over a century became a living and very vivid language and a developing language. And this is the everyday language in Israel and the first language of everyone who was born in Israel. The Irish language has been promoted very heavily in Ireland by the Irish authorities for many years. And I believe we have a lot of experience to exchange here on how making an older language becoming a more common language. And this is important, I believe, as Hebrew is important for us, Irish, I know its importance to the Irish people. I believe we have a lot to cooperate on that. And that also, here it's also teaching methods, and also very important, teaching adults, language training for adults. a field in which Israel has a lot of experience because of the immigration waves, and Ireland also is dealing with. So I think this is something very important, and that touches also upon the issues of diaspora, where the two countries have very big and important diasporas all around the world, and the issue of relations between the mother country and the home country and diaspora is also a very interesting issue, in which I believe Israel and Ireland have a lot to cooperate and to exchange info and perceptions.
Mr. Ambassador, before we leave, I understand Israel is going to be marking a major event, a milestone in its history of the state. Tell me about it.
Well, actually, this whole period is few weeks, which we are more or less in the middle of, is a period when we mark few historic milestones in the history of the Jewish people and the state of Israel. Only lately, we marked the holiday of Pesach, Passover, which is also called the holiday of freedom, of liberty, and marked the exodus from Egypt. This is actually the first time that some would say that this is where the Jewish people was formed as a people, as a nation. And that was only a few weeks ago that we marked it. Yesterday, as I mentioned, we marked one of the major catastrophes, maybe the biggest catastrophe in the history of the Jewish people, and this is the Holocaust. That was yesterday. Next week, we are marking 2 days. The first one is the Memorial Day for the fallen in Israel's wars and the victims of terrorism. And just the following day, we'll be marking Israel's 73rd Independence Day. So you see in the space of only very few weeks, we go from the creation of the nation of Israel, the people of Israel in biblical times, remembering one of its lowest point, its greatest catastrophes, the Holocaust, and from there to the building of the new state of Israel by marking both the Memorial Day and then the Day of Independence. So this is a very meaningful period in Israel for Israelis and for, I believe, Jews everywhere. Yes.
Well, congratulations, Mr. Ambassador. Congratulations to the Jewish people. I hope you have good celebrations and commemorations of those who perished in the Holocaust. It serves as a reminder that justice, peace, and a path towards diplomacy is humanity's best and remaining hope. To get you out of trouble with the Dubs, I promise that I'll get us a couple tickets and we'll sit in the Hogan stand and watch a match at Croke Park. I wish you continued safety, peace and prosperity to your people, with your neighbors. And let me just say that we're glad to have had you today on In Conversation this week. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Today we've had as our guest, His Excellency Mr. Ophir Kariv, the Ambassador of Israel to Ireland. We wish them well and we'll see you soon.